This is obviously at Dumbarton UMC. I don't know what state it's in, but Mark Holland, head of mainstream UMC, gave some history. I've put out some feelers to see if this history is inquiries to see if this history is legit. I haven't heard back from any of the experts I wrote yet, but we'll listen to it together.
You probably already know it, but in 1972, the General Conference decided that the prohibitions against divorce for clergy were no longer necessary, so they took those out of the Book of Discipline, but added in instead prohibitions against homosexuality, and added the language into the social principles that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And we've tried for the last 50 years to get that language removed. And it would have been removed already, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is the way it is. Sometime in the 80s, they were concerned that pastors were going to be gay, so they passed prohibitions on ordination, including...
So just real quick, I think Holland is right to say that the liberalism, the liberal impulse within Methodism, it didn't begin with divorce, but abandoning a biblical position on divorce directly did lead to the groundwork on undercutting other topics involving the nature of family and sexuality and all this stuff. So his point is well taken. That's at the very beginning of the denomination. 1968, I think, is when it was founded, but it was 1972 at that general conference that they really hammered out a lot of this stuff. And then he's going to make the case that he's going right into it. Conservatives just were really paranoid about gay people being gay and doing gay things. The only reason conservatives advanced these things was because there was activism on the left. There were already clergy that were advancing this cause quite dramatically and scandalously that then they responsively created legislation in response to. So it's a little bit disingenuous the way that he frames this here.
You cannot be a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which just introduced don't ask, don't tell into the church, which has its own harm. Then they thought people might want to get married. And so they added prohibitions against marriage in our churches and by the clergy. And then we shouldn't fund the gay agenda. I don't know what that is, but we're not going to fund it. So there was a funding ban put in place that said no money could go towards that. Probably the low point of that was in 2016 when there was a petition for the church to support anti-suicide measures for LGBTQ youth. And that petition failed. And I'm telling you, if we can't stand up for our kids to prevent suicide, what are we doing as a church? So all of these prohibitions have been in place.
So a lot of history, a lot of stuff thrown at us right there. One is anyone who says they don't know what the gay agenda is lying. It's normalizing non-normative sexual behavior in relationships. This is something that legislation was passed because they were, as a denomination, people within it wanting to advance the normalization of gay and non-straight sexual, not just identity, but exercise. And this was violated most recently by General Board of Church and Society giving a grant to Reconciling Ministries Network to write a curriculum for Vacation Bible School that is being used now, I think. So I've reported on this, but these are real things that were being done. It wasn't paranoia. It was in response to things that were being done. Now, I don't know the insides of what happened around them rejecting this. I don't know if it must have been a resolution, but if I were to be voting against something like that, it would be the specific emphasis on LGBTQ youth. Anyone with a heart is going to be against suicide in any youth whatsoever. But to focus on that one demographic, it creates a wedge where this is an issue where, well, and this is what liberals have done is if you do not take our position, you are causing the suicide of youth. You are directly resulting in these youth hating themselves and killing themselves. And so when conservatives refuse to participate in that narrative, it's not that they don't care about these people made in God's image, it's that they reject the framework for this stuff. So I don't think Holland's point is well taken here. And part of me thinks that he may be so small-minded as to really think that conservatives are just that hard-hearted. But I think he actually does understand, and he just knows that he gets points for being disingenuous with the bad guys. So we can go on a bit further. This does, if you're not interested yet, it does get pretty interesting.
So all of these prohibitions have been in place. And if you have any friends who are Presbyterians or Lutherans, I confess I do have some.
Har.
You probably wonder, well, their churches moved past this 12 or 16 years ago. And what is it with the United Methodist Church?
Moved past this.
And it's because of our interesting global structure. So I'll just say a few words about that, and then we'll jump in.
You know, they moved past this biblical holiness thing a while back. What's with the United Methodist Church keeping holding on to biblical holiness? What's with these backwards people?
What the legislation is. Prior to the 1980s, in the 1980s, actually, the number...
Here's the new piece of information. This is what I don't know is if it's true or not, but if it's true, this is very interesting.
The number of delegates from outside the United States to General Conference was about 8%. And there was a practice really, there was no written policy, but there was a practice at that time that when churches outside the United States grew to a certain size, they would become autonomous Methodist churches. They wouldn't stay in the United Methodist Church, they would become autonomous. So all of the Methodist churches in Mexico, Central America, and South America are all autonomous Methodists. They're not part of the United Methodist structure. That's also true for India, China, Korea, Malaysia, Australia. Now, Australia came from the British Methodists, so we're really not accountable for that group, but they're autonomous as well. So all these groups are autonomous. In fact, according to the World Council of Churches, there are 10 million Methodists in Africa. 5 million are autonomous, and 5 million are United Methodist, because the first group came of age prior to the 1980s when we had a different practice. There was no...
So this is where I need history buffs to say, okay, was it really the assumption that any missionaries sent out by the Methodist Episcopal Church or United Methodist Church or predecessors that once this missional area built up, that they would not try and be in fellowship with them, they would just set them loose and let them be autonomous, and that something changed in the 1980s? Well, he talks about why it changes, so that's the next thing.
Formal vote taken at General Conference, but there was a decision made in the 80s and 90s that instead of churches becoming autonomous, we would add them into the United Methodist Church. And there are 3 reasons for that. One is a good reason. The other 2 require different levels of cynicism. So we'll see how cynical you're feeling today. The first good reason is the United Methodist Church in the United States is overwhelmingly white middle class. And global diversity adds a richness to the church that can't be measured. It matters. The global diversity of our church matters.
I actually agree with him on that. I think most of us do. That I was talking about this last week with the Korean American new annual conference, how really this separation is not good. I like that he can say that. It's obvious he doesn't believe in it because he's not willing to. It's not just him, it's a whole demographic in America that they'll give lip service to this concept, but they won't actually compromise what they want to do in the church. They do what Holland does and says, hey, we kick in 99.4% of the global money. We're going to do what we want to do. Don't stand in our way. We're going to advance our agenda, and we know that it's going to alienate most of the black and brown people, but that's our prerogative because we have the money and we are on the right side of history. So I like that he can see that. I don't like that he doesn't seem to actually believe it.
That's a good reason to include folks into the denomination. The more cynical reasons were, I don't know if you're aware, but in 1965, the United Methodist Church started a numeric decline in this country. Now, it's more fun to say this when my dad's sitting here, but it started the year he got out of seminary. And you just can't deny, I tell him all the time, Dad, you can't deny the correlation.
Har.
But the church started to decline. By receiving churches from outside the United States, we are no longer a declining denomination. We're now a growing church again. The other more cynical reason is some people at General Conference realized these were reliably conservative votes that could keep the church more conservative than the U.S. church would have been. If the U.S. church had voted just the U.S. church, we would have removed this language in the prohibitions on ordination and marriage 12 or 16 years ago. And we haven't been able to do that. So 8% in the 1980s. Right now, the number of votes is 45% from outside the United States. That's going to flip to 55% in 4 years. Right now, we have a disproportionate...
So he gets into the contemporary situation, and then that's where we are. So I'm going to read the comments here. I see that a lot of people engage this, but Tom Lambrecht actually knows his business. He was the author of that last article we read, and I asked him about it. He did get back to me. He says, this explanation from Holland is an incomplete explanation. It's not false. It's incomplete. He says, General Board of Global Missions actively encouraged autonomy for Methodist churches outside of the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s. They got the message that they weren't really welcome in forming the United Methodist Church. That changed as time went on, and most Africans, Filipinos, and Europeans stayed connected. So what he is saying there pretty explicitly, to my mind, is that prior to that point, they were kind of racist as a denomination. We were kind of racist as a denomination. We did this mission work, but we didn't really want them affecting us. And then at a certain point, our consciences were moved to understand that people who are equally made in God's image deserve a seat at the table, and then that growth happened. Now, the other argument from Holland was that there were cynical reasons for this. We were in decline in America, but we wanted to have rising numbers. I don't have a hard time believing that, because a lot of United Methodist leadership did not like keeping accurate local church records on membership. They wanted inflated membership, and there were all kinds of incentives there. So obviously, yes, we love our big ballooning budgets and membership rolls. And then the other one was that conservatives noticed that people outside of the U.S. were conservative, and so they wanted them to join. To say that that was a primary driver, maybe, I don't know. I don't know these guys. That's what I'm really interested in. But, I mean, as a conservative, I don't need that, but it is icing on the cake. To my mind, I mean, it's just so weird how this whole conversation gets divorced from the scriptures. For those of you who watched the Considering Charlotte segment that I've got coming out tomorrow, we had Lloyd Nirota on there, who's a Zimbabwean living in Canada. He's part of the Western jurisdiction, or I think he is. He was nominated as a bishop there. He is all on board with regionalization. He's one of the Christmas Covenant authors. He's a neo-Marxist. I don't know if he identifies like that, but he sees everything through the lens of oppressed and oppressor, and he thinks that Christians just need to leave each other alone. Like, that's what we do. And to a degree, I'm with him. I think Christians should not coerce one another, force each other against our will to do things. But I don't think that we should leave one another alone. I think that is unbiblical. I think the only biblical position to take is that out of love we interfere with one another. We don't force each other, but we do interfere with one another. And that's what's disappearing with regionalization. It's just, you leave us to our mess, we'll leave you to your mess, we'll have a few things in common. And I just think that that's theological. Like, I can't recognize that in the Bible. And I talked about a lot of this last week in the Korean American Conference thing. But I just think they've really warped the clear meaning of the scriptures to make room for doing what they want against the corrective of other people who know the gospel. You know, I guess so. I anticipate Holland would say, you know, if they were on our side, you wouldn't say the same thing. I just think there's the truth of the gospel no matter who's on what side. You know, I don't think the truth hinges. I mean, the only person whose side that matters with respect to the truth is Jesus, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. So any side Jesus is on, that's the side of truth. And the side of racial or ethnic separation is not of Christ. You know, it's frankly un-American. And so it's just crazy to me that we find ourselves at this point where we're segregating. Chris Roberts said, that's a minimalist approach to the history, but he's right so far. That was early in. Ed says, this explanation explains their strategy to remove the language and the later enforcement and finally the funding restrictions. Yeah, I think you're right, Edward. Jeff Dollar said, my weasel detector keeps going off listening to this fella. I've watched a good deal of Mark Holland, and actually this is one of his less weaselly presentations, if you can believe it. And, you know, he's one of these people. This is the thing that drives me nuts about partisanship. There are a lot of people that I feel like I could actually get along with under the right circumstances, but because I don't want to say anything else mean. They're just mitigating factors that make it so that there are people that I would otherwise like that I take offense to, and I don't appreciate that. Nathan says, I don't personally know the details of what he's saying, but it has been my experience that anti-LGBTQ suicide support is pro-LGBTQ social reform. Yeah, and I said pretty much that. So, but yeah, when I mean, this is what not just the left in the UMC, but the Democrat Party in the U.S. does. There's a problem we all agree on. Here's our solution. Oh, you don't like our solution? Well, then you want that to stay a problem. And it's like, no, that's not really what's going on here. We disagree on what needs to happen to ameliorate the problem. But that's harder to understand and use that critical thinking rather than that tribal part of the brain. So I'm sure Republicans do it too. I don't want to start that fight. Fred says Pennsylvania has 3 United Methodist conferences. Yeah, Susquehanna, Eastern Pennsylvania. I forget the other one. Western is mostly Orthodox conservative except for the city of Pittsburgh. That makes sense, yeah. This stuff largely tracks with urban-rural divide. Chris Roberts says, I was at 2016 General Conference. There were 2 petitions on teenage suicide, one targeting LGBTQ teenage suicide, the other more general. The more general one passed that supported ministry to all teenagers struggling. You know, that's a really important thing. I wish I knew that history well enough I'm glad you wrote this because that shows the lie in what Holland was saying here. Holland wanted to paint a picture like we're so poisoned we don't even care about the youth anymore. That's not what was going on. Ugh.